Great. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the Sustainable Small Harbors event titled Helping Coastal Communities Reimagine Their Waterfront. We're happy to share this project with you today in collaboration with a number of partners. First, my name is Amy Samples. I'm with Michigan Sea Grant, and I'm going to walk you all through a little bit of housekeeping before turning the program over to our principal investigator, Don Carpenter. First, you are all joined in this meeting on listen-only mode. Apologize for the lack of a two-way conversation here, but this is the technology we have to make sure that we can share our slides with you. So again, you all are participating in listen-only mode. If you would like to pose a question for us, please do so using the questions or chat feature, and we will attend to those at the end of our time together today. We have a number of panelists joining us who will be introduced in their turn. We will be recording this webinar and posting that recording to our project website. We've shared that URL with you in the chat box. You'll also see the URL again later on in our slides. So we will be sharing both that recording and a copy of the slides. So without any further ado, I'll turn it over to Don Carpenter.
Thank you, Amy. So I hope everyone can hear us well. I'm going to start off by introducing the people there in the room, and then also the people that are going to be participating in this webinar remotely. So I'm going to work our way around the table here. First, we have Emily Fennell from the Office of the Great Lakes, Catherine Rising from Michigan Sea Grant, Dave Knight from David Knight LLC, and formerly of the Great Lakes Commission, Sanjeev Sinha from Environmental Consulting and Technologies, Rhett Register from Michigan Sea Grant, Geneva Langland from Michigan Sea Grant, and you already heard from Amy. Also, Todd Marcy from Michigan Sea Grant is joining us today. Remotely, we have Mark Riederlin from Traverse City. He'll be covering part of the webinar today. And then as well as Paul Peterson from Lansing is going to be talking from the DNR. And then we have some guest panelists from New Baltimore, which is John Dupre and Bonnie McNamara Slater. And then Dan Sullivan will be joining us from Ontonagon. So we are having some audio difficulties, it looks like. So just give us 1 second to see if we can sort that out. We've had 3 or 4 people let us know that we have some shaky audio for some of you. So we're going to see if it's on our end or not. Just give us 1 second, please. Okay. All right. So we're gonna continue. So with this project, this has actually been this is a very large project. It was originally initiated in 2014 through the Michigan Sea Grant Integrated Assessment Program, but as the project evolved, it actually ended up being a very unique and unprecedented consortium of funding agencies and partners. So you can see that the Michigan Sea Grant is the title organization at the top, but funding as well as contributions came from the DNR Waterways Program, the Office of the Great Lakes, the Michigan State Housing and Development Authority, and then the partners that were part of the research team that will be introduced a little bit later were Lawrence Technological University, ECT, Veritas Economic Consulting, and then David Larkin Knight LLC. What are we going to be covering today? So our agenda is first Dave's going to spend a few minutes talking about the need for the project. Why did this project, why was it proposed 3 years ago, and what was the impetus for getting it started? Then Emily Fennell is going to be talking a little bit about the state perspective and what their goals were for funding this project and getting involved. I will be covering kind of the actual project overview. That's different than the agenda. That is what we actually accomplished as part of the research project. We're going to hear some testimonials from New Baltimore and Ontonagon who went through the Sustainable Small Harbors program. Then myself and Mark Riederlin will be discussing the findings, outcomes, and implementation piece. And finally, Mark will wrap it up with the future directions before we take Q&A in the last 20 minutes. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dave.
Thank you, Don. This conversation really started about 7 or 8 years ago with the convergence of 2 patterns or trend lines that had really serious consequences for Michigan small harbors, actually Great Lakes small harbors. One of those trends was natural and one was fiscal. The natural event was largely a climatic one that started when Great Lakes water levels started trending downward in the late 1990s and hit historic lows in about 2012. And I'm sure many of you have seen this chart and seen this pattern and remember the hardship that was caused when we hit that historic low in 2012, a low at least in the time that records have been kept. And many harbors experienced severely impaired navigability, and some were actually faced with potential closure. And those are death sentences to harbor communities with a very short season and a very heavy reliance on a working harbor. The other critical pattern that emerged at about the same time, coincidentally, had to do with the federal role in maintaining the 40 or so federally authorized harbors in Michigan and the 80 or so others around the Great Lakes. Budget constraints for the Corps of Engineers at the time forced them into a triage of sorts in which they had to deprioritize the shallow draft harbors, federally authorized harbors, and concentrate on the cargo ports, the deep draft ports. And that policy actually remains in place today. And you can see the consequences of that as the Corps essentially pulled out of the dredging program for the small harbors. And it's still pretty tentative today. I should mention that efforts are afoot even today by the Great Lakes Small Harbors Coalition, led by Checkmate and others, to reinstate that federal role, and largely through the reform of the Water Resources Development Act and the Harbor Maintenance Tax Handling policies. But there is still much uncertainty going forward, and I think that environment, these two realities, these two trends, and I should also mention that the state of Michigan, I got to give credit to the state for coming in the darkest hour in 2013 with a $20 million plus emergency dredging program, and that should be acknowledged. But going forward, looking ahead, there's still great uncertainty about the federal role in dredging and harbor maintenance, and I think that many communities, coastal communities, see the wisdom of a self-sustainability strategy, and that was part of the need that we wanted to address. And as we talked with more partner agencies, Sea Grant, MSHDA, Office of the Great Lakes, and others, we then became aware of a much broader need and the need for a deeper dive into small harbors, if you want to pardon the language. The opportunity was there for a much broader investigation of harbor sustainability, both on the water, as far as navigability, and on the land. You've got to realize that these communities, the harbor communities, are crown jewels for the state of Michigan. They're incredibly valuable assets for both quality of life and for economic growth in what we are still in, a transitional economy that places a lot of reliance on tourism and recreation. But we have to remember that all these ports and harbors, large and small, have industrial roots. They were built and designed originally to handle goods, cargo, and people. They were transportation, basic transportation. This is Charlevoix, Michigan in the 19th century. You can see a lot of smoke, a lot of working vessels, a waterfront dominated by industries like lumber mills, farther down the lake, steel, iron foundries or granaries involved, and a lot of heavy industry. A lot of smoke, a lot of vessel traffic. Now looking at Charlevoix today, you can see the same view, and obviously it's been repurposed, redesigned, and has a much different look and no smoke, at least on that day from the cement plant. The wind was blowing the right way. But what is true is that these harbors were built for industry and have evolved it for a different purpose, and there's still a lot of vestigial parts of their design built around that industrial original use. So change happens, and it continues to happen, will continue to happen. I think the challenge that we saw for these communities is to shape that change and not let change shape them as much. What I think this project is about is helping communities adapt and respond to changes that they can't control, but also identify and address those that they can, and do it as preemptively as possible. In other words, be able to see over the horizon. So it's not about this project, the needs for this project is not just about sustaining navigability, but also sustaining livability and attractiveness to visitors and authenticity, that which makes these coastal harbor towns unique. So I think you'll see real value as we go through the project today. Just another shot of Charlevoix in the old days. It was dominated by masts in the old days, and even today, still dominated by masts, but there's no lumber involved. So as we go through the project today and see how these needs have been addressed, I think you'll appreciate the processes and the outcomes that we came up with.
Thank you, David. So next you're going to hear from Emily Fennell. She's going to talk about the state's perspectives and what their goals were in undertaking this project. Emily?
So as Dave mentioned, the state of Michigan's interest really began a couple of years ago when we were dealing with the emergency dredging situation back in 2013, 2014. And the Department of Natural Resources Waterways Program invested about $21 million into some emergency dredging that was made available for recreational harbors in Michigan. And we were really interested at that time to start to think about long-term sustainability of our recreational harbors and how can we help communities start to plan for those long-term needs. We were seeing a lot of short-term focus. Communities were thinking about, what do they need to do to keep their harbors open for that upcoming boating season. And oftentimes the harbor was viewed as a liability and not integrated into a community and economic development plan, such as the community's capital improvement plans. In addition, in 2015, the Michigan DNR Waterways Program began to require 5-year recreation plans for harbor communities in order to be eligible for grant and aid funds. So we wanted to help communities have the best tools available to develop some really effective 5-year recreation plans for their communities. We wanted to start to think about, how do we help communities be more self-sustaining to address the needs of their community and help them plan and meet those long-term needs of the harbor. What were the long-term boating trends looking like? What kind of infrastructure would they like to see in their community if they were to build their harbor today to meet the needs of the next 20 years? What would that look like? From the Office of the Great Lakes perspective, we were also really interested in bringing together a number of partners that are currently working in coastal communities and figure out some effective ways to align our resources and the way that we engage those communities to focus on long-term strategies. And we look to our partners at Michigan Sea Grant, Lawrence Tech, ECT, and a number of other partners that have been involved, Michigan Economic Development Corporation, DNR, even Michigan State Housing Development Authority. So this has been a really unique collaboration of multiple state agencies and institutions really coming together to help communities implement long-term strategies for the recreational harbors. And it's really about what is that future vision for the community that integrates the harbor into their overall future community's vision. What would they like to see for the next 20 years? We hope that the results of this project and the tools and best practices that we'll talk about more as we go through this webinar will really be transferable and applicable to other harbor communities around Michigan's coast, as well as Great Lakes communities that are facing similar challenges. Some of the goals that we were hoping to achieve are laid out in this slide. We want to make sure that recreational harbors were really integrated into community and economic development planning as strategic assets. How do we really help communities leverage the economic capacity of that harbor from an environmental, economic, social, and cultural perspective? It was really important to us to make sure that harbors and waterways were well maintained and they supported recreational and commercial use and access to our water resources. And another important recognition was that there are limited state resources available to invest in these communities. So how do we make sure that we're investing in a strategic manner so that we have sustained public access to our water resources? And as I mentioned, making sure that the tools and practices that we identified in this project are really transferable to other communities, and that the learnings that we've had and the case studies and the proof of concept communities can be transferred and help other communities be successful.
Emily, thank you very much. So you've heard a little bit now about what the state's goals were and where the project started. So let's talk a little bit more about what the actual project is. So as I mentioned at the beginning, the project started off as an integrated assessment being funded through Michigan Sea Grant, which means it had a core research question. And that core research question was, what are the key barriers to small harbor economic, social, environmental sustainability? And what are the tools that would help small harbor managers create more stability in their communities? So when you think about that core question, when you think about that core question for a second, what we're really talking about is, when you think about sustainability, it's really that triple bottom line definition of stability. We have to have a place that people want to live, work, and play. And so that's really what we try to focus on when we went and visited these communities as part of the project. So the team itself, we actually had this large project research team, and that was broken down to the research team, which was Lawrence Tech, ECT, Veritas Economic Consulting, and then David Larkin Knight LLC. That was the research team who was integrating the integrated assessment piece of this. We were supported by the state agencies, which are the Office of Great Lakes, Sea Grant, DNR, and Michigan State Housing Development Authority, and then also the Michigan Economic Development Authority. And then finally, what we had is we had a series of partners that were part of the advisory board. And so the advisory board were stakeholders and community representatives that kind of guided us through the entire project. If you looked at some of the people on our advisory board, it was the Waterways Commission, the Michigan Boating Industry Association, the Great Lakes Harbors Coalition, Land Policy Institute, members of the Michigan Municipal League, as well as private industry. This advisory board was actually very important in the process for a couple of things. So one is they were our sounding board. As we were advancing the project through 2014, 2015, they made sure we asked the right questions. They made sure we engaged the right people. And then as we developed the tools and the tactics, they gave us feedback on that as we went. So, anyway, so moving forward then, we also asked that each of the 4 case study communities put a person on the advisory board as well, because we wanted them to be integrated as part of the project, not just be a member of a case study team, but really part of the broader leadership. Okay, so what we did is we started off with, we really had to talk a lot about a placemaking strategy, right? And then how do we create value for this? And so part of that came through the National Charrette Institute process, or the NCI. The National Charrette Institute process, one of the first things we heard with every community we went to is, what's a charrette? So I imagine that on the phone today, probably 75% of you at least have no idea what a charrette is. But effectively what a charrette is actually the word for cart in French. And I found this out for the first time about 4 years ago myself. And I like to tell the story just because it makes a lot of sense. So the word charrette is cart in French. And where it really came from is the artists in Paris at that time were frantically trying to finish their wares so that they could then sell them to the local community. And they would literally ride around on a cart and do rapid prototyping and drawing, and then sell their wares to the communities. And so that's really what this project is about. We would actually engage these local communities, and we would be working frantically while the community stood and looked over our shoulders. And we're going to get into a little bit more detail about the National Charrette process in just a minute. The next thing was the Establish a Tools and Tactics Guidebook. You're going to hear a lot more about that, as well as the 4 case studies. And then finally, at the end of the project, we wanted to disseminate it through webinars such as this, as well as summary report, case studies, fact sheet, and a very robust website that will be introduced to you at the end of the project. So let's talk a little bit more about the NCI Charrette. Well, what this really is a community visioning process. And so as part of that community visioning process, what you do is you start off with a public visioning meeting. So you go into a community and you ask them about what their vision for the future is. From there, you have what they call a work cycle, where you actually generate alternative concepts. So every community we went into, we listen to the community, we talk to the community, and then we post 3 kind of alternative realities to the future of what we would call Pentwater 2035 or Ontonagon 2035. From there, we went back to the drawing board. We talked to the community again. They got an opportunity to give us feedback, another public review meeting. That generated a preferred plan or a common vision for the future. After that, we had the open house review. And then finally, we finalized the plan development and presented a final public forum meeting. So this is kind of the multiple quick review loop sessions associated with the charrette. So what did this actually look like for the community? Well, to actually put this in the context, we developed what we were calling a 1-3-1 model, right? And the 1-3-1 model refers to one day at the community where we do the initial visiting exercises, which is where we identify the community's assets, weaknesses, barriers to becoming the community they want to become, and then what are the connections both to the waterfront as well as the surrounding area. Non-motorized access is becoming a much larger point in the state of Michigan, and we wanted them to think beyond just the motorized boats or the cars, but broader connections to the trail systems that are very important to the economy of the future. From there, we went then the 3 days, the 3-day charrette, that was the intense working sessions that I just referred to in the previous slide. And then finally, we would go back to the community and do a final presentation. So to give you an understanding of what that looked like for, say, Pentwater, it was actually about a 2-month engagement process. We went there in March, then went there in April for a very detailed 3-day work session where we worked nonstop for 3 straight days. And then finally went back almost 2 months later for the kind of the final community report. So that's the 1-3-1 model you might hear us refer to later. Okay. So the charrette team itself was led by the extension offices, Michigan Street Grant and Lawrence Tech. We were part of all 5 charrettes, the 4 case study communities, and the 1 proof of concept. And then we were supported by several planning and design firms that helped along the way, Edgewater Resources, Studio CI out of Southfield, and then Richard Newman's Architects. So for that, I've given you kind of a brief overview of the project and the actual community engagement part of it. So now you're going to get a couple of testimonials from communities that we embedded ourselves into. And that first testimony is going to come from New Baltimore. So Mayor Dupre, if you're available.
Hi, Don. Yeah, I sure am. Thanks. Thank you, Don. The city of New Baltimore is a waterfront community on Lake St. Clair in southeast Michigan. Water is our biggest asset. Other than that, we're mostly a bedroom community. But we're very, very fortunate to be picked as one of the 4 pilot project cities for this project. And I want to say thank you to Michigan Sea Grant and the entire team. Again, our residents are very, very fortunate. And these team members came from all over the state, and you had to be impressed by their expertise. So they came to New Baltimore in February of 2015. I think it was the coldest February in the history of the state of Michigan. And we had very good participation from I didn't know what a charrette was either, and nobody else did. We had very good participation from our residents. We met in our local library. And after the charrette process, asking residents what they wanted, what they saw, a sustainable harbor was shown to be the #1 objective to improve our city by the residents. And it's because water was shown to be our biggest asset and our biggest ability for placemaking to improve our city. So after this process was done, this really gave us, the city of New Baltimore, momentum to pursue a grant with the DNR Trust. And the grant was, the objective of the grant was to get enough money to purchase a local marina that was privately held. After the process, we were successful in getting the grant. We haven't completed the deal as yet, but it is about 4 blocks from our downtown area. It's called Schmid Marina, and we hope to have this done shortly. We're still working out the details of the deal, but we couldn't have done this, I don't think, and had the momentum and had the support of all the state departments like we did unless we were a member of this charrette process. We learned a lot. So what we do from here on in is we hope to use the tools that we learn from this whole Sea Grant process, Sustainable Properties Progress, Sustainable Small Harbors Progress, to assemble a team here, which we have, to as we move forward, to be able to better manage our lakefront properties. We have a number of them, but we don't have any way to do that. And this Sustainable Harbors project gives us the tools to do that. And what it does is to make our community better. And it does it by improving the quality of life of all the residents of our city. I think it improves the quality of life of all of the residents of Southeast Michigan and the state of Michigan. And I think that we have already shown that since the Sustainable Harbors project has been completed, that the emphasis on our blue economy is greatly increased. Our city is progressing, we're expanding. And this had a lot to do with it. We have now have people coming in from all over who want to invest in our city because it all started, I believe, with the Sustainable Harbors project. And I think New Baltimore is going to be a small town, but we're going to continue to be part of our blue economy here in the state of Michigan. So again, I can't say how grateful I am to be a part of this project.
Thank you, Mayor Dupre. Really appreciate that. Can you tell me the story about the big flag on the screen real quick? That flag wasn't there when we visited.
Yes, we had a water tower. Was not in use with our water department. We have New Baltimore is a full service community. We have our own water plant, our own sewer plant, our own police and fire, and so forth. But we had a tall water tower, and it was a landmark from all around the lake. You could know exactly where you were by seeing the water tower. And you see that circular blue container, that water tank. It was right behind that. Well, once we had to take that down for a number of reasons. And so the local Lions Club decided they have to do something. So to put up another landmark for boaters. So they came up with the idea of putting up a flagpole. And this one that you're looking at now is the tallest flagpole in the state of Michigan. It's 160 feet, point something. And it is, I'm not quite sure whether it's the tallest or the third tallest east of the Mississippi or not, but it's quite a landmark. The flag is 30 by 60. And if you come into New Baltimore, you can't miss it. It's a beautiful, beautiful thing that our local Lions Club did, and it's a big asset to our town.
Thank you. The reason I asked about the flag is when we were there, the water tower was listed as both an asset and a liability. It was a liability in that it was rusting and no longer structurally safe, but it was an asset in that it was the drawing point from the marina side, from the water side of the community to bring people in. So I just wanted to point out that even though you lost that, the important part of having that beacon to bring people in was identified through the process. I'm glad to see the flag. So thank you.
You're welcome.
So next we're going to talk about Ontonagon. Dan Sullivan, are you online?
I am. You hear me okay?
Yeah. I can. Dan, are you joining us from Ontonagon today or somewhere else in the world?
Not today. I'm in sunny Atlanta, Georgia, where it's about 80 degrees and beautiful, but kind of wishing I was up in Ontonagon usually, as usual.
Dan, I'm just going to quickly say that you fly. You're a professional pilot.
That's right.
And that despite the fact you fly all around the world, that you call Ontonagon your home, and that I want to use that as a setup as you talk about the process from your eyes.
Yes, I do, and that's great. My family has a long history there. My great-great-grandfather was the first lighthouse keeper. I have a lot of family there, so I have a long history, and I intend to retire up there and live there. But I can tell you a little bit about how we got going on the project and what we learned about it. When we in Ontonagon, a few of us heard about the Small Harbor Sustainability Project coming to town, we got together and immediately what we did was contacted the media. Ontonagon is a a small community in the western UP and the southern shore of Lake Superior. Economically, Ontonaga's been hit very hard. 1996, we lost our big copper mine at White Pine due to closure. And in 2008, we lost our paper mill. Smurfit Stone went bankrupt and knocked down the paper mill. So we lost two of our biggest employers. And we were quite depressed economically. A lot of people had left. And the town was basically kind of floundering. Well, we were sure happy to, to have the Small Harbor Project come to town. And so we got together and immediately contacted the media, print media, TV media, started talking on the radio, and we started to at least get the idea out to the people that, hey, this visioning project is coming to town. This is a real plus for us. Let's get together with this thing and let's see what happens. And we were very successful in getting our public to buy into the visioning that the project brought us. One night, I believe it was a Friday charrette night, we had 10% of our village population show up at that charrette, which, we're about 1,100 people, and we had about 110 people show up, which was phenomenal for us. And what it did, really, I heard New Baltimore talk about this momentum. That is absolutely what happened with us. We were able to get our people kind of solidified in purpose because, it just kind of brought us together and it was hope. There was some hope here. And the momentum continues to carry through today, a year and a half after you guys were in town. We continue to have momentum. As a matter of fact, we applied for a placemaking grant with Wupperter, one of the local organizations that offers grants. And today we learned that we were the recipient of a $5,000 placemaking grant that we're going to use for a public beach up there. That is all a result of the Small Harbor team coming to town. And one of the things that happened when you guys came to town is the village council got together and adopted your vision as a template for our future planning. And immediately along with that is they reinstated the DDA, the Downtown Development Authority, and we got together with a group of people and started working towards the vision that you gave us. So it has been just wonderful for Ontonaga as far as momentum goes. We're in the process of opening a beach. One of the things that happened as a result of the charrettes was the people said they wanted more recreational facilities there, wanted it to be a little more of a tourist town. So we've been working hard with opening a beach. We worked with Lakeshore Systems, who owns that there's a big shipbuilding yard right on Lake Superior, right at the end of our main street. We were able to lease about 4 acres of land to use as a public beach, and this placemaking grant is going to be used in the building of that beach. So, and we continue, little victories beget bigger victories. So, we have now some positives with this grant that we've gotten, and we're going to work with more. But the greatest thing is the village manager has a copy of your final report. And when something comes up, he will always hold up, whatever the picture is, the final picture, and say, here's what the Small Harbor team envisions for us. And this is what they use as their template going forward in planning for the Rec Commission. It's the template, and it's a template that we're going to use for the next 20 or 30 years. So, we're very grateful that the state of Michigan, invested in us, and we're trying to make the most of it here in Ontonaga. So I hope that gives you a little bit of a, idea of what we're doing.
Yes, Dan, thank you. Thank you for sharing the recent successes as well. The one thing I want to say, I'm going to react to that with 2 points. So the first point was it's your vision. We just facilitated the process. So we were there not to tell you what to do, but we were there to coalesce your ideas for the future into something that's coherent, a coherent plan for you. And the other thing I wanted to react to is you mentioned the report. For those of you who are online, you're going to see a website later but the full Charrette reports for all 4 case study communities are online. So you can, when Dan says this is what the village manager holds up and shows everyone, that actual report is available online. So Dan, we're very happy that you could join us today. Appreciate you taking time out of your busy travel schedule to join us, and it's great to hear that you guys are making progress on your vision. Very exciting.
Right. Appreciate it, Don. Yes, thank you.
All right, so moving on. So you heard a little bit about the Charrette process, the community engagement design process, and then you heard a couple testimonials from 2 of our communities. But one of the things we said is we've just kind of wrapped up this multi-year research program, right? And so I'm going to spend a little bit talking about the findings and outcomes of the research part of this before Mark Breederman will talk about how we are moving to the future. So what are some of the findings, right? So by the way, that's Ontonagon in the background there. And one of the big findings we had are historical impediments. You heard Dave Knight talk about the aging infrastructure and the industrial past of a lot of these communities. And so pretty much every community we went to had either real or perceived impediments. And this could be anything from a legacy industrial facility like we heard about already, or it could even be a social construct, right? It wasn't necessarily a physical impediment. It could be an attitude impediment or a social impediment that needed to be resolved before a community can move forward. So working with the communities to articulate what those historical impediments are was important before they can move forward. So the next finding is that these visioning sessions, right? I know we've been calling them charrettes, but they're community visioning sessions. Having these long-term engaged visioning sessions was absolutely critical. Working through some of the other communities where we didn't necessarily do the full 1-3-1 model, the results weren't as impactful. So having that longer-term opportunity for everyone's voice to be heard, and then a discussion of the sensitive topics for those communities, and then taking that to this vision for the future. You heard from 2 of the communities, but the other communities have similar stories. So we're going to advocate for community visioning sessions moving forward. You have to have a local champion. What I think is important to notice here is that the local champion can vary. So the local champion for New Baltimore was very much Mayor Dupre, an elected official. He was the one really beating the drum. Dan Sullivan is an engaged citizen, so a stakeholder, a business owner as well, but he has no elected capacity in the city. So you can have a local champion that doesn't always have to be an elected official. It can be a municipal employee, it can be an engaged citizen, but it's really important to identify that local champion and then have an implementation team. Nobody can do it by themselves, right? You have to put together a team around them to implement the plan. And that's the next finding, is that you have to have these plans aligned. We've already heard about recreation plans, waterfront plans, master plans, capital improvement plans. Any community's got, I don't know, half a dozen plans or so sitting on the shelf. One of the things we found from this project is you have to really look at those plans with a critical eye and really focus on the waterfront of your community. That's the first thing, is align these plans with each other and align it with your waterfront. A lot of these communities, despite that history that Dave Knight talked about, a lot of them have not really looked at their waterfront as an asset and a plan to move forward with that. So that was one thing that was eye-opening for us, is sometimes the amount of thought that was given towards aligning the plans and focusing on the waterfront, may not be what you'd expect. Which leads us to the next one, which was value capture, right? One of the things you heard Emily talk about is that a lot of the communities looked at the harbors and the waterfronts as liabilities, a place where they're going to have to spend money to improve. Well, part of this program went through taking the mindset change. You had to view your waterfront as an asset. And once you were able to view the waterfront and the marina as an asset, you were then able to leverage the value capture. And that value capture could come through an increased tax base. It could come through tourism revenues. It could come through grant funding. One of the things both New Baltimore and Ontonagon experienced was the idea of going out and acquiring grant funding. But you really heard loud and clear from Mayor Dupre about all the private investment that's going on, right? So they made they engaged in this project, made a commitment to their vision of the future, and they're seeing private investment coming through. So there's an opportunity for value capture in these communities beyond just grant dollars. can't underestimate the importance of partnerships. And how do you go about identifying those partners and engaging those partners? Mark Bruderland is really going to cover this a little bit more detail in the next segment, but you need to figure out who your partners are, whether it's the media, whether it's the marketing, whether it's a regional development authority, but also reaching out to the Extension Service and Sea Grant and the Waterways Commission. Paul Peterson, the DNR, is on the phone. He might talk later. There's a lot of partners out there that are available to you, and that's really important to figure out who those partners can be and how they can help you. Because I guarantee you there's a lot of people in the state of Michigan that want these communities to be successful. And then finally, the last finding has to do with the visitor experience. So if you're coming in from the outside, what do you experience? And so the visitor experience itself, what we found is that a successful, sustainable waterfront has these 4 elements, right? Has to be accessible. It has to be accessible both from the waterward side, making sure the harbors are dredged and kept up, and has to be accessible from the landing side, right? We already talked about the public access is critical, especially as we are doing more to a non-motorized economy. So it has to be connected. You know, don't underestimate the importance of local Wi-Fi and internet in your downtown. People want to be linked. They want to be linked not only with nature, but also with their smartphones, right? Parking is a key aspect in a lot of these small communities. They have to be diverse. You know, one of the things we heard in several of the communities we visited is what we don't need is another t-shirt shop, okay? Tourist shops, t-shirt shops are important, but you really do need to have kind of more of a diverse waterfront so that not all of your eggs are in a single industry or a single basket. So that allows your community to be more physically and economically resilient. And then finally, it has to be welcoming. This is one of the things coming from the outside. It allowed us to really, with a critical eye, look at how welcoming a community is. If you live somewhere, you know where everything is, you know how to navigate. You don't necessarily think about what it is like to be a visitor. So a lot of what we found was that a lot of these communities just didn't have enough signage or enough opportunities for people to find out what's happening in the community. So marketing, media, signage, all of those things play a very important role in a vibrant downtown and a good visitor experience. So those are some of the key findings. The biggest outcome of the project was the Tools and Tactics Guidebook. This is a fantastic, visually appealing publication that was put together with a tremendous amount of help from the Michigan Sea Grant staff. It really summarized 2 years of work. It is available in its entirety online. I'm not going to walk through the entire guidebook because that would take too long, but I just want to tell you briefly the sections that are in the guidebook. There's a chapter on the project that's really kind of highlights some of what Dave Knight was talking about, what Emily Fennell was talking about. It also talks a little bit more about the Great Lakes environment, dredging efforts, as well as more about the placemaking and some of the things that we found are important through the process. All 4 of the community profiles are in there. So this really highlights the 4 case study communities, the work and efforts that went through there. And this is where we go into a little bit more detail about best practices, the findings, and the visitor's experience that I just shared with you. Chapter 3 is economic sustainability. The economic sustainability piece, you're going to hear more about value capture. You're going to look more at what does it mean to be economically sustainable. And then there's a couple really nice short case studies that Dave Knight helped contribute to that talked about South Haven as a model for self-sufficiency, and also the concept of a dredging collaborative, where harbors are actually taking ownership of their own sustainability efforts by collaborating on dredging. And so that's happening both on the West Coast as well as some of the Michigan towns are starting to look at these dredging collaboratives and putting things together that'll be better for shared economic sustainability. And then the last chapter of the guidebook, again, it's about a 60-page guidebook, but the last chapter of the guidebook is the tools and tactics. And the tools and tactics really also has the flow chart. And Mark Bruderland is going to be talking about that. So I'm not going to go into any detail, but I do want to point out that a hyperlinked version of this document is available on the project website. So we're going to refer to, or Mark's going to refer to, a lot of resources. All of those resources are available on the website and through the hyperlinked version of the PDF. So if you download the PDF, you'll find it's a very user-friendly experience courtesy of the communication staff here at Michigan Sea Grant. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mark.
Good afternoon, everybody. Mark Bruderland here with Michigan Sea Grant. And I'm going to talk a little bit about implementation. And perhaps you're one of the many coastal communities across Michigan or elsewhere that wants to begin to start something like this, and maybe the state or the group is not, you don't have the opportunity to be a pilot like some of the like Ontonagon and New Baltimore have been for this project. We are going to just kind of talk about what are some of the essential things that the whole team put together, and I think I'm going to go right to the next slide and show you the team really did a phenomenal amount of thinking, and we're going to kind of just delve into, if you want to envisage rolling up your sleeves, where would you start? What are some of the essential elements? And again, as Don just talked about, you know, the inventory, both of the community and the waterfront, and then your visioning, planning, the value capture and implementation. And I know this kind of fonts are a little bit hard to read. We're going to dig into this, but you'll see the tabs over there on the left side of your screen. And that's really the highly recommended, we really consider those essential elements of kind of sustainable small harbor waterfront stuff. I mean, if you wanted to say required, we didn't want to use that term quite so much, but they really are essential. And then the second tab, which is in blue, is the recommended, and you're going to see some other, you know, information and available resources that are highlighted in blue. And then we also had kind of as we researched and delved into the kind of the best practices and things that are available nationally, we put in kind of the third level of additional resources. Some of the stuff is fairly thick. Don mentioned it is all, there's links to all these things, so you don't have to search too far to find them. So we tried to make that pretty available. So those are the things, you know, what are some of the things that you have to do? And we're going to start kind of talking about these in a section. So let's go to the next slide. So again, when you think about New Baltimore, here is pictured on the left, and I think that's Pentwater on the right in these images. But you know, communities typically have a community master plan, cities, townships, villages, in Michigan, of course. And again, Don already stressed that, you know, kind of how the waterfront's not necessarily fully considered in some of the traditional master plans and things. So you start about that. So let's go into the next slide. We're just going to talk about a few of the essential and then the recommended, the next level. So this is on the community side. So again, your goal is trying to delve into this, you know, maybe a refresher or your community really has some needs to update its waterfront and the community desire there. These are some of the things that you actually have to have and really a reasonably updated take on them. So existing tourist information that could all be gathered, that's certainly always up to date. Your community master plan, your zoning maps. Hopefully you have a capital improvement plan, and if not, hopefully you can begin developing one as where the investments are made from that city, township, village. Certainly your regional plans, excuse me, a little bit broader context, and then you know, kind of the broader land use data. Those are essential things. You see, I skipped over the first one, and the first bullet in there is your possible participants and leadership. And again, maybe you've heard it already throughout this webinar, but identifying the right set of leaders. Sometimes it can be at the city council level. It can come from a downtown development authority. It could come from a chamber of commerce. It could come from a Lions Club. We even heard the example of the Lions Club there being a champion for that really tall flagpole there in New Baltimore. So again, sometimes it's helpful if you have some help from outside to kind of focus that, but it can be done internally. So, but that really does need to come together and you know, identify some of those leadership and kind of have a time frame and set that out. Of course, to dig a little bit deeper in your community, you want to look at other, you know, leadership charts, certainly dig into the census and employment data. I've already seen some good examples of, you know, kind of updated aerial photos. Obviously, drones are kind of shooting a lot more footage of some of our communities these days than just a few years ago. And any recent user feedback and surveys, those would be really recommended to add on to that community inventory. Let's go into the waterfront inventory. So again, at the waterfront level, do you have good marina statistics? Do you have, you know, for instance, you know, the both boats that have been berthed there or launched? You know, do you have a few years of a financial summary? We had a few of our cases that we kind of reviewed and stuff, and they actually run their harbor as kind of an enterprise institute of a city, and they really had some excellent information on that. So again, make sure that that data is being collected so that you can use it in a really good way in the future there. We also have in Michigan and neighboring states have kind of a clean marina program. Again, that's kind of a voluntary self-assessment checklist. Again, some of the best practices of ways to kind of make sure your marina is optimized. You definitely should be looking at local sediment dynamics. We've talked about the dredging issue, and we have some, you know, the Corps has some pretty good historical stuff on that. Maybe your community has some of that. But again, how much sand or other sediment is coming in from, you know, nearshore currents, longshore currents, or coming down a river system, for instance. Now, at the recommended level, this is some of this stuff is actually pretty easy to get. Is the you have to kind of know where on the Corps' website, but you can download the Corps' information about past historical dredging, and they have a detailed site of what was, maybe if you're a federal harbor, what the specific area that would have been dredged. And also, the Corps flew kind of throughout the whole Great Lakes Basin, and it's 2012, so it's a few years dated now, but it's a really nice, free oblique waterfront photos. We were able to kind of capture those and print those in 3-foot by 4-foot size maps and kind of tape them all together, just to really give a nice view of the waterfront. So the oblique photos are available. Again, we have a hyperlink to that. And again, maybe there's some other local photography at the waterfront level that you could look at. Let's go on to the next section, visioning and planning. Visioning and planning, as you know, is huge. Let's go right onto the onto our chart there. Again, a facilitated community vision meeting. Again, that's talking about how is that set up, who's invited. You know, the meetings that had such great success weren't due to this team coming in from outside, but really due to the community. So when Dan Sullivan talked about 10% of the village's population, that was due to the great efforts that happened in Ontonagon, tremendous efforts in all the other communities, including New Baltimore. But that was the desire of the community. Get a snapshot in time and get the people out and listen to what they're saying. We really enjoyed just trying to capture all the great input that people had and a passion for their community. So again, there's a lot of different charrettes and reports and lots of resources here on our website that we really want you to dig into. In Michigan, of course, the MEDC has these redevelopment ready community best practices, and that's actually a very good thing. I think many of your communities may be participating or are at least aware of that. That's certainly a great strategy. It also really helps with funding in the future in Michigan. The Land Policy Institute at Michigan State has a placemaking assessment tool, again, that's available and you can walk through. And again, just Dan mentioned again in Ontonagon where they've kind of become engaged and active with their like regional planning efforts. And I heard the great success about a grant just today. So make sure that those things are part of your, you know, kind of extra efforts that you want to do for that. Again, at the recommended level, there's some other resources available. We have some Michigan Coastal Community Working Waterfront resources that were developed a few years ago. There's a smart growth for coastal and waterfront communities. And again, if possible, we put down kind of at the bottom is conduct the National Charrette Institute charrette. Now again, there's different varieties. We promoted the 131, but you could do a lot in just one evening if that's what your resources allow. So that's really key, and I just think it brought an opportunity, and somebody used the word that this is an opportunity to talk about, in a sense, somewhat taboo topics. So I've got an example in the next slide of just to look a little bit of what we did for capturing some of the input, of course, and these are either called wordles or just different text sizes. How many times was the word marina mentioned? And you make that into a big font. The computer is able to do that. Parking, marketing, what are all of the opportunities and issues, and again, just kind of put those up there. So this is one of the output products. We spent a lot of time kind of taking the feedback that was written and on various forms and putting them into these Wordles, but just gives you a nice snapshot and a little bit of a consensus indication of what direction the community wants to go. Let's go into value capture next. Don's already set this up well. Value capture is what's going to, kind of drive the longevity of being able to have a sustainable harbor on the fiscal end. So you need to have the very good information, and I think Emily talked about kind of some of the requirements the state of Michigan has now, but again, here is make sure that at local level that you're doing those expense and income balance sheets, the harbor marketing opportunities that are out there. There are some tools, depending on the jurisdiction, maybe there's some opportunities for things like a tax increment finance district that might touch the waterfront or the marina, or making sure that the marine investment, the dollars captured from the local marina would actually be reinvested in there. You really, if you look at it, and I think Paul Peterson could talk about this, most of these marinas and harbors across Michigan are really, they generate a lot of money for their local community, and it's good for the dollars to be planned out for that harbor and waterfront and not kind of moved elsewhere into their township, for instance. So those are your value capture options. Again, there could be some great opportunities for public-private partnerships through time, and even simple things. I'll just throw this out there. One of our communities just mentioned that they hadn't really been actively collecting their boat launch fees, and that's usually $5 a pop or whatever, and they started enforcing that, and that actually really helped provide some dollars to improve some of the nearshore areas. I think you heard maybe from some of the communities, obviously the grant funding opportunities can be a real big boost. So again, some of those are ongoing, some of those are local, some of those could be done at a community foundation level, for instance, but be sure you're aware of those and how you can maybe get things set up for that. At the recommended level, again, there's a My Place Resources section that's, again, from the state of Michigan, and we also had a Sustainable Working Waterfront Toolkit, a kind of a national snapshot of what are the different elements and tools that are used nationally there. So those are all available. Let's go to the next slide, please. At the implementation section, and again, implementation is going to be dependent on so many issues. And I just wanted to talk about the first one, the form an implementation team and identify task leaders. And at the end of one of our, in Rogers City, actually, I'll just give them a big shout out because they self-identified that they didn't want this plan to sit on a shelf after the team came in there, and they formed what they call a super positive group. So it's led by the super pos, as it's known, was led by a city councilman, and he grabbed together the Chamber of Commerce and another business leader and a few others, and he's just like, I've just seen too many of these things just sit on a shelf, and so we want to make sure that we're going to come up with a schedule and we're going to task things out and we're going to make sure that we keep some momentum going. So those kinds of creative ideas really came from the community up. This wasn't academics or professionals kind of bringing those things down to the community. So I think you'll find those kinds of examples across the system. Again, looking at your existing plans with your focus on the waterfront, this is kind of that standard list: community master plan, the recreation plan, looking at your waterfront operations and maintenance, certainly the zoning and the ordinance. Sometimes the zoning board of appeals, there's been a lot of work on form-based code, and some of that definitely applies in these downtowns and waterfront areas. Capital improvement plan is a huge tool, and again, we found some of the communities, again, are probably a little bit behind on this, but I think that they're trying to come up with ways to map out how do they invest the capital dollars that they have coming in and make an intentional plan, whether it's a sidewalk connection or a universal access or some of those kinds of things, but just make sure that it's mapped out. And people like parts of MSU Extension will come in and give an updated way to develop a capital improvement plan. So reach out to agencies like an Extension Service, and they may be able to assist your community. Obviously, you have to have an emergency response plan. And again, the recommended stuff here is redevelopment ready. Make sure that you could be a clean marina community, and really consider those dynamic water levels That's really a key thing as Dave Knight has started. Let me go to the next slide and talk a little bit about future directions. So this project has been ongoing for several years, and we're excited to just kind of talk about a little bit about the future directions and some, hopefully a little bit of wisdom. But we've been learning from the communities and their different innovations that they have. So again, the team and across Michigan, you heard it from the state a little bit, how do we encourage these coastal community innovations and kind of what works best for everybody? So that's something we want to continue to hear, and what creative ideas. I mentioned that enterprise fund in one of our communities. That's actually South Haven, Michigan. I know at the community level, sometimes you get new city managers. I believe there may be a few city managers on the webinar today, but sometimes somebody comes from a community that's not a coastal community. Again, what are some of those issues and opportunities that coastal communities have, and really responsibilities? Maybe you're not dealing with water levels if you're in the middle of our great state, but you are if you're along the Great Lakes shoreline. What are the issues and things that a city manager needs to kind of be aware of? So maybe there's some opportunities that we can, as MSU Extension and Sea Grant Extension, maybe there's some opportunities that we can interface with the groups. And you heard some of the mention of Michigan Municipal League and others to try and reach people as turnover happens, retirements, those kinds of things. Again, Don mentioned so strongly about the opportunity to leverage and partner, again, where existing institutions are. This team from the DNR Waterways Commission and the Office of the Great Lakes Coastal Zone Management, this is really a great set of institutions when you look at the whole of the project. And again, where resources allow, we want to continue to build on that. Don talked about how many people want to see the community successful. So again, we want to hear what works and what doesn't. And again, whatever the different venues are for that at annual meetings of a Michigan Association of Counties or the Township Association or whatnot, what are ways, maybe there could be sessions at some of those annual meetings and those kinds of things in the future. Along those lines, it's a great segue to the next slide, just a little plug. A year from now, we're hosting in Grand Rapids, Michigan, a national conference on working waterways and waterfronts. And this will be the fifth one, usually about 300 to 400 people attending from around the country. It's the first chance we have in the Great Lakes. And so they're going to do some field trips and see some of the coastal communities, 45 minutes or so away from Grand Rapids. But again, this is a great opportunity to network and hear different success stories and maybe some failure stories or whatnot, just ways to kind of promote the activity there. So just put that on your calendar. Hopefully you'll see some more stuff on that in the future. I think I'm going to turn it back to Don to just mention about a couple things on the project website, and then we'll be going into questions and answers fairly soon.
Thank you, Mark.
Thanks,
so
Don.
as Mark mentioned, this is a good opportunity for you to type in your questions. We've have a couple of questions that have come in, but while you're thinking about any question you might have, it's a good opportunity now to type them in. I briefly early on mentioned the project website. It's a very robust website, a lot of information about the process, the communities we've engaged, the tools and tactics guidebook is in there, the flow chart that Mark just walked through is in there, and has the hyperlinks or hot links to all of these resources. So when we dealt with St. Ignace as one of the case study or one of the proof of concept communities, one of the things that they said about the flow chart was just how easy it was to access, and they realized they didn't have to read everything, but that they could kind of go through it, get a feel for it, and then see what was appropriate for their municipality, being St. Ignace, and what they could utilize. Okay. So here's contact information. So this is the Sustainable Small Harbors at umich.edu is the email. Somebody will get back to you. Mark's information is on there in terms of future directions. And then my information is on there if you have any questions about this specific presentation here today. Okay. So one of the questions we had was, can you talk more about the dredging collaborative? I'm actually going to ask maybe Dave Knight to field that question. He's been probably the one who's been most engaged in that.
Sure. The dredging collaborative is a concept. We've seen it in practice, and it's a concept that's really new to the Great Lakes. We really haven't seen it among small harbors in the Great Lakes yet. But in Oregon, the state of Oregon, 9 communities, coastal communities got together. They were pretty remote. Their dredging costs were very high for them to bring in contractors to their individual communities. They persuaded the state to buy the equipment, and they actually trained their staffs to use it. And it's become a very effective approach to a collaborative, again, among small harbors that don't have the means individually to operate a dredging program, but collectively we're able to do that. New York State has also pursued the concept, and they are still talking among a group of about a dozen small harbors on Lake Ontario. So it's conceptual, but it makes a lot of sense, especially where you have a group of small harbors in relative geographic proximity, like a range of harbors at perhaps the southern part of Lake Michigan or the northern coast of Lake Erie. Again, where individually it's tough to become self-sustainable and get all the equipment to dredge a harbor with a frequency that may be only every 3 or 4 years, but collectively in a group, it starts to make a lot more sense.
Okay. Thank you, Dave. So I'm just going to serve as moderator, and as we get through the questions, I'll try to direct them to the right person here. So another question that came in is, what does it cost to use your services to hold these series of meetings? That is a very hard question to answer because of the wide range of variability in terms of quote unquote the services. A lot of these community meetings, some of them could actually be done relatively affordably if you engage with Mark Briederland or some of the Extension or Sea Grant staff. There are local offices that can kind of help you with the community visioning sessions. If you want to engage in a much larger community visioning session, sometimes those can be on the order of $10,000 to $20,000 for like a long weekend, sometimes even more, depending upon the size of the report that you might want to receive from that. So if you decide you want to engage in community master planning efforts associated with your waterfront, you could probably either contact us and we can help put you into touch with some of the professionals that do that type of work. There are grants available to support this. Some of this particular project cost our case study communities nothing because we receive grants and funding from the state. So there are opportunities for grant funding associated with doing these community visioning sessions. All right. The next question I have is, can you discuss what sort of economic analysis was carried out or we should be considering? And for that, I'm going to ask Sanjeev Sinha to answer.
Thank you, Dan. So the economic analysis for this project was focused on each harbor that we went to. The economist that we had on the team was from Veritas Economics. His reports are on the website as well. By the way, I wanted to mention that if you forget the links, if you Google small harbors, that's the first link that should appear on your screen. So obviously it's getting a lot of hits, otherwise we wouldn't have that. So if you pull the individual site visits or the harbors that we went to, you can look at the economic analysis reports for each and every individual harbor. The engine for the economic analysis was carried out using a software called Implan, I-M-P-L-A-N, which is an economic assessment software system. It's pretty standard in the industry. Actually, most of the economists, both in consulting as well as in academia, use that. And what it does is it contains a set of extensive databases that have economic factors, multipliers, and demographic statistics with information on 528 different industry sectors. So we use that to essentially create the 4 or 5 options that we received at the end of every charrette. We use that to come up with a profit revenue model, and the findings, you can find that in the economic analysis reports. Back to you, Dan.
Thank you. So another question that came through said, this process seems more geared for city waterfront harbors than harbors of refuge. Can you speak to smaller harbors without retail, et cetera? I'm going to answer part of that question and then probably ask Dave Knight to chime in as well. You are correct that all the K-State communities we visited had waterfront, downtown kind of interfaces. Some of they were also harbors of refuge. So there were, all these harbors also had designated, harbor, well, not all of them, I should say, because the New Baltimore did not. But a lot of these were dual purpose harbors. And so there is some of the economic value capture pieces of this are true. You do need to figure out some of the long-term sustainability issues are just maybe a little more difficult with some of the smaller harbors of refuge. So Dave, would you like to kind of speak about that a little bit more as well?
Well, one concept or one discussion that happened several years ago and continues to take place to some extent, having to do with harbor maintenance and the federal role that we discussed a little bit earlier, is whether there really is a federal interest and is this federal economic development in the terms that are used or regional economic development? In other words, is the Corps responsible for the regional economic development goals? And some players in the game thought it probably wasn't. Harbors of refuge don't have that economic factor in play. Theirs is a question of health and human safety. There should be certainly federal interest in that as it applies to the Coast Guard and NOAA and all the agencies that are involved in health and human safety that have anything to do with the Great Lakes. So I think harbors of refuge have a strong case as we go forward and find a federal dredging program that has room for small harbors. And for harbors of refuge, there should not have to be any economic justification or economic, whether it be federal interest or regional interest. This is a matter of health and human safety. Should be able to use that heavily going forward to persuade the Corps of Engineers to, and perhaps in collaboration with other partners, the state might be involved also, but that should be a strong argument for those harbors to be maintained.
So thank you, Dave. So another question that came in, I was reminded, by the way, that All Gray was one of the communities, and they didn't have like a downtown waterfront situation. So we did have a K-State community that did not have kind of a downtown waterfront aspect to it. Another, keep your questions coming. These are great. So let's see. I'm reading them as they come in. Has anyone compiled any numbers as to the average amount of economic benefit a community receives for each boat that comes into the harbor? Is there an opportunity to receive support to conduct such a survey of marina to provide this information to community leaders as we discuss annual budgets and renovations of expansion projects? Some of that economic analysis has been done. I'm not sure if we have the people in the room that know the answer to that specifically. Dave or Paul Peterson, maybe?
Well, I can speak to a study that's perhaps a little bit aged. I think it was finally completed about 6 or 7 years ago on the economic impact of boaters, recreational boating. It was a MSU sponsored study carried out by a team with some very strong and accurate algorithms and methods. And that's out there and still would have a very accurate portrayal. It has some actual tools that you can use to compute, based on marina slips. The Great Lakes Commission actually was the partner, the sponsor of that too. There's another study ongoing right now that I think they're still trying to build support for, working with the waterways, with the Michigan Ports Collaborative, and some partners to refine that a little bit more and be able to generate that economic impact quotient on a couple of other different factors. I think it's number of boats, but there are tools available, yes.
So Paul Peterson, if you're still on the phone, you might want to talk about that. So the question had to do, so Paul, can you hear me all right? Paul Peterson, can you join us? Might have lost Paul. Oh, hey, Paul. So the question was, I don't know if you heard it right, but the question really had to do with, is there resources available to kind of a survey of boats berthed or boats launched and how much economic benefit might come from boaters coming in and out of a harbor. Would you or Lene have any information about that you might be able to share?
I do know this, that one of the potential new waterways grant applications, and both with the city of Alpena and the Port Collaborative, is such an animal. They're looking to develop that has some predictive elements, some asset management, and to essentially, now this is my simple man's way of saying it, a tool that can help communities with, if they were to invest in a certain capital component, what the outcomes could be. That, like I say, that's a potential grant. They would be moving ahead to develop that. So at this time, it's not available, but I think in the future you may see that, and then it would be available to the harbor community.
Okay, thank you, Paul. For those of you who joined late, that's Paul Peterson on the Waterways Commission. He was part of the, Office of the Waterways, DNR. The other thing I think I want to mention on that briefly is that South Haven has done a very, very nice job kind of documenting their value capture and revenues associated with basically the boat traffic and what they need. So one of the things you could do on the website is look at the city of South Haven, and they've got really did a very nice job at looking at the balance sheets for both revenue and expenses in terms of financial stability. So another question that came in is, can you confirm the name of the software that was mentioned for the economic analysis? So Sanjeev?
Yeah, it is Implan, I-M-P-L-A-N, Implan.
And is that
you can also Google that, by the way.
Is that a proprietary software or public domain software?
It is a proprietary software, yeah.
Okay, so if somebody really wanted to do an economic analysis with Implan, they'd probably need to reach out to a natural resources economist then. Okay, thank you. The next question we have is, what are resources to draw upon if a township with waterfront is proceeding without authorizing private development that is not environmentally sound and has the potential negative impacts of freshwater dune ecosystems? That's a very difficult question to answer without more information. But I would say that is one of those things where you need to look at the public. You should definitely engage the public in that one. So the public input process. There are very kind of strict rules for development. So there is a permit process that needs to be, that you need to go through both the joint permit with through the state. So it has to be permitted before it can be built. So if they're trying to get around permitting, that's another issue.
Hi, this is Catherine Rising. I'm over here at Michigan Sea Grant 2, and I just wanted to say, I mean, that is a complicated question, and I think this project itself has been dealing more on assisting community with developing plans. So I think what your question kind of highlights is the need for communities to think through development plans. How do they want to plan for future land use in their community, and what kind of regulations do a township want to set up so they can guide those kind of developments? So I think right at this table, we don't really have those kind of regulatory experts, but we are thinking about these things into the future and how can communities plan for those kind of concerns that you seem to be bringing up.
Okay, thank you. So next question that came in is, networking was mentioned earlier. Did you find evidence of pre-existing networks among case communities with their nearby communities? If not, does a harbor community anticipate networking with other similar communities? I would say, and others can jump in from the team, that there was not, through the case study communities we went to, there were some existing networks, but not as many as you might think. This project actually brought a lot of those networks together. So one of the things we would encourage is to engage both this research team as well as perhaps Paul Peterson to the DNR or other local communities to actually look at some of these regional networks that might come up. So does anyone else from the research team want to talk about networks? I would say we didn't find a lot of existing networks, but this process helped form networks.
Don, this is Mark. I'll just comment real quick that it seems like the only ones that occurred in the past where there was different mayor exchanges between different coastal communities. We certainly noticed that, but those had been over a decade ago, so nothing active and ongoing that really stood out. And again, there's a great opportunity for that, and many lessons to share with each other obviously the nearshore dynamics and things are going to be different in your individual community, but all these processes that we've tried to capture probably a lot the same. So anyways, I would encourage that.
Hey, Mark, this is Sanjeev. So I wanted to add a quick point here. I think it was interesting as we were giving the talk today, the thought that came to my mind was something called maybe Harbor Champions, a way for the team led by Mark Bitterland, Amy Samples, and Catherine, et cetera, to consider cooking a proactive community or gathering of harbor town officials and key players that can actually keep the dialogue going. And it was interesting to me because Dave Knight is sitting right, next to me, and he wrote a comment saying we should really consider something like a coastal college. So the idea was very similar, just with a different name. Just something for you to consider, Catherine, going forward.
Okay, do we have any other questions? All right, well, I think, there's one last question. Sorry, this will be the last one. What small harbor town will we be going to next, and how can we get involved? I think that's a question for Mark Biederland.
So I would encourage anybody that's interested to be proactive and trying to contact, myself and the state, whether it's the Office of the Great Lakes or the DNR Waterways. We're hoping to be able to find some resources and cobble those together over the next few years to be able to do at least a couple more communities. And so if the timing's right, I think timing can be critical. And we actually approached some communities to potentially be pilots, and they turned us down because the timing wasn't good. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just when you find the right timing, encourage it to kind of be proactive and reach out and see if we can all work together and make something happen. So there's no specific list of what might happen next, but again, we'll try to respond as our resources allow. So great question. Thanks.
Thank you, Mark. And with that,
this is Catherine. One more thing. I think it was a great comment about developing a coastal college, Michigan Sea Grant developing a coastal college. And I was reminded that we have one of our extension representatives, Mary Bowling, has been developing something called a water school that's supported by Michigan Sea Grant. And that helps to educate local officials and investors about some of these critical water-related issues. So I encourage you to look that up on our website and contact us if you have any questions about that.
Great. So thank you very much. Again, the website is sustainablesmallharbors.org, and if you Google Sustainable Small Harbors, you'll absolutely pop up near the top of the list. We thank everyone for joining us today, and enjoy the rest of the sunny afternoon.